Hello, everybody. Good evening. If I had more time, I'd give you a long apology for last Wednesday, but I have so little time, so I'm just going to have to suffice with, I'm sorry, and when people are in different time zones, strange things happen. I came exactly an hour late to last Wednesday Zoom, and I really feel terrible about it. Hello to all of you. Our topic is to talk about the Rebbetzin, about the Rebbe's wife. I don't know your last name, but your first name is obviously Chayamushka. You mentioned that the Rebbetzin was in the shadows. She was behind the Rebbe. It's quite clear and obvious to people who pay attention that the day that Rebbetzin passed away, the Rebbe took her out of the shadows. The Rebbe very much wanted that the Rebbetzin should be in our lives. I'm a born and bred Lubavitcher. You know, I never made this choice. I was born into this. And when we were growing up, the Rebbetzin was literally out of sight and to a great extent out of mind. If I had seen the Rebbetzin on the street, I literally would not have recognized her. I would have no idea who she was. She would have known who I was, which is another great miracle. She knew everybody without ever walking around in the streets. But the average Lubavitcher Chassid never saw her. The Rebbetzin passed away, and the Rebbe opened his home. The Rebbe's house became an extension of 770. It became essentially a shul, and it remains that way to this day. And the Rebbe invited us into that world. And the Rebbe went out of his way, to a very great extent, to ascertain, to guarantee that the Rebbetzin would become very public, which he had not been during her physical life. The Rebbe himself saw to it that this should become public. There is a very unusual exchange between the Rebbe and a rabbi, a very prominent, respectable rabbi named Rabbi Yossi, who questioned the fact that the Rebbe was making the Rebbetzin so public. And the Rebbe said to him, wrote him a note, which is very widely publicized, in which the Rebbe said it's very important that the Rebbetzin become a public person because it'll benefit us. The Rebbe used the phrase, which he had used over and over again, V'achayit in alibe. The living will take to heart. And since that time, the Rebbetzin is on our walls. Rebbetzins' photo was on our walls, something which never happened before. And our children, of course, are named after her. But more importantly, the inspiration and the message and the life that she lived and that she inspired is able to inspire us. And this is what I would like to use the few minutes that I have with you to share, to talk a little bit about that Rebbetzin. Like I said, I never knew her during her physical lifetime, and everything I know about her I either read or I heard anecdotally from people who knew her. And of course, we're always learning more about her. There are stories coming out, there are people revealing personal interactions with the Rebbetzin. The first thing that has to be said about the Rebbetzin, she was not an ordinary woman. She was a giantess. She was by no means an ordinary woman. There was something extraordinary about her. And I'll tell you what I mean when I say that. There is a phenomena in the world of a genius. And then there's a great person. There's a great distinction between a genius and a great person. We all know some geniuses. Geniuses are exceptional in one way, whether it's in their mind or it's in their talent as an artist or a musician. And geniuses, forgive my candor, often are strange because they're so preeminently one thing that the balance of being a person is completely out of whack. You know, you have geniuses who can figure out mathematical equations that take supercomputers who can't button their shirt straight. And to a great extent, the two go hand in hand. The person who's a genius is just been gifted by the Creator, by God, with one area of greatness. And because they're so great in that one way, it sort of takes them over, and in many other ways they're deficient. A great person is a genius in every area. That's the only way I could say it. A great person is not a genius. They have genius, but their genius is balanced. The Rebbe was obviously a great person. The Rebbe is a great person. And the Rebbetzin was also. She was a giant. Not in one way or in two ways, but in many, many ways. And if you met her, she was just a Mrs. Schneerson. She was a simple woman. That's the sign of greatness. Greatness is the ability to keep the genius together. That it shouldn't stick out like a sore thumb, but it's wrapped so tightly, so neatly, that when you meet a great person, you're meeting another person. And it takes years and years and years and years to unwrap, to unravel, to discover all the areas of genius that are tightly wrapped into this simple, ordinary human being who interacts and interfaces with other people on their levels. You know, I've heard from some of the brightest people in Lubavitch who would spend time with the Rebbe. And they would observe that one of the things that was so outstanding about the Rebbe is you never ever felt inferior. Whoever talked to the Rebbe, from the greatest minds to the simplest of people, felt like the Rebbe is talking to an equal. The Rebbe always found the place where you and him met. It's silly to think that you and the Rebbe met, but the Rebbe never talked down to you. He always talked to you eye to eye, panim b'panim, shava b'shava. The greatness of the Rebbe is impossible to measure, but the Rebbe's ability, you know, as Rashi says, lahaloich neged ruche shel kol echad ve'echad, to speak to each person where that person was, as though they were just equals, was extraordinary. And the Rebbetzin had that quality as well. She talked to each person on their level. It's true of the Rebbetzin, however, that she, I guess they could put it this way, she harbored many secrets. I don't mean this like she had some shadowy side, but in the Rebbetzins interactions, from everything that I've collected, she very, very much controlled the narrative, the relationship. The Rebbetzin was incredibly gracious, unbelievably kind, deeply concerned, and full of love for anybody that was in her sphere. But it was one way. She gave. She didn't let you in. I have never met a person who could say that in the relationship that they had with the Rebbetzin, there was something equal about it. But she shared her personal self. She really didn't. She controlled all of her relationships. There's probably many ways of explaining it, but the best explanation for it is because we were not her peers, we were not her equals. It's just that simple. You can only share with somebody who's on your level, and that Rebbetzin was bigger than us, on a scale, on a measure that I feel we don't even begin to appreciate. Just the human attributes that the Rebbetzin held together inside of herself that made her not just a genius but a great woman. She couldn't share them with us because we couldn't appreciate them. Reb Zalman Garai, just to give you a simple example, Reb Zalman Garai knew her very well for many, many, many years. And he said that she had the mind of her father. She was she had an incredible brain. He said, Gehad dem Tatas Kop. He said, you can't say Aleina Rebbe. She had her father's mind. She could have been a Rebbe herself. And this is just one component of this woman. So there's the woman that we saw, the woman that the Rebbetzin allowed us to see, and then there is who she was. Who she was, the Rebbe knew, and I think that's about it, you know. One of the sweetest series of exchanges, it's incredibly sweet and moving, is between the Rebbe, the previous Rebbe, and our Rebbe. The Rebbe and the Rebbetzin got married, and they almost immediately left home. Right, the Frierdiker Rebbe at that time, the previous Lubavitcher Rebbe, was living in Latvia, in Riga. The Rebbe, our Rebbe, was not allowed to stay in Latvia. I don't know the reasons, but it was immigration stuff. So they had no choice but to move to Berlin. So they got married, let's say, in November or December, and by March or even February the following year, a couple months later, they had to leave. And the Rebbetzin lived with the Rebbe for about 13 years in tiny little apartments in Berlin and then Paris. So the previous Rebbe corresponded with them extensively, and they recently published much of that correspondence. And one of the sweetest things that you have in these letters is the previous Rebbe writes a letter to his son-in-law, to our Rebbe, and says, do you recognize the great pearl that I gave you? And the Rebbe responds to his father-in-law, I don't recognize the pearl. And then a month passes, and the Rebbe asks again, do you recognize yet the great pearl that I gave you? And the Rebbe responds the second time, no, I still have not figured out what it is that you're referring to. So the Rebbe writes a third time, also spaced by a period of time. He says, you have not recognized the great gem that I've given you. I'm referring to my daughter, your wife. That's how the Rebbe writes to the Rebbe. And this was not just a doting father trying to look after his daughter who was married to this big tzaddik. It was the truth. And for the Rebbe to say he didn't recognize the pearl, that can be explained in more than one way. But for the previous Rebbe to tell this to the Rebbe, it wasn't just said to be fatherly. It was the truth. And the Rebbe and the Rebbetzin shared each other, and they shared with us. They were not stingy. They shared with us whatever we could take. But the parts of themselves that we were not in a position to relate to and to internalize, they just kept it from us. No point in giving us gifts that we're not able to hold. And I think to an extent it defines the kinds of relationships that the Rebbetzin had with all the people with which she interacted over many years. I want to talk about 2 points about the Rebbetzin, which I think are very important. But I want you to hear them in the context of what I just said. The Rebbetzin was a very complex woman, a very, very dynamic lady. Very, very alive, very alert, very sharp, always, even the last minutes of her life. And incredibly aware of her environment, incredibly intelligent, very, very sensitive. But it was veiled. You only saw what she let you see. There were 2 things that I think are very important to mention in any kind of an event that involves women in Sheikh Chabad. The first is the message that the Rebbetzin tried to communicate. So many people talked about how the Rebbetzin talked to women about their homes, their families, their husbands, their children. Mrs. Hager from London, there's actually a film where you can see it. She knew the Rebbetzin from the time she was a little girl, and they had a very, very personal relationship that was probably 30 years old, close to 25 years old. And she related that she was asked to speak about the Rebbetzin after the Rebbetzin had passed away, and the Rebbe approved. She actually sent the Rebbe a copy of her speech. And then when she came by dollars, she told the Rebbe that she shared with the women of Neshek Chabad that the Rebbetzin had taught her the value of being a mother and a homemaker, and the Rebbe said, and a wife. We live in an age of women's liberation, and a part of women's liberation is correct and due, maybe even overdue. But much of women's liberation is unfortunate, because, as the Rebbe said it once, it's not making women liberated, it's making women into men. And there are certain things that women can do that men simply can't. They don't have the skill set. And it seems to me that the Rebbetzin went out of her way to instruct, with her words and her example, young modern women, and not such young, not such modern women, in the value of being a wife and a mother. It was very important for her that the women she knew should know that it was important to her. Such simple things as where they shopped and what they bought for their children and what they were serving their families for dinner. Simple things like that. And the way they related to their husbands. And quite a few ladies have talked to this. There's a woman I know who's very, very intelligent, who told me that she was frustrated with the Rebbetzin because she was an intellectual and she was a scholar and she was worldly, and the Rebbetzin only discussed fashion with her. The Rebbetzin just would go, whenever she came to see the Rebbetzin, she would raise a subject, and the Rebbetzin talked to her about her shopping. And she said, I couldn't understand why the Rebbetzin insists on talking about fashion, and she didn't talk about anything else. I think part of that is, these are the kind of walls that Rebbetzin put up. Her relationships were very, very carefully controlled by her. But a part of it, I think it was an instruction. And the women who allowed themselves to be inspired by the Rebbetzin learned that as much as career is important, and succeeding financially and in the greater world, She wanted to teach women the respect and the honor and the gift of being a wife and a mother. Because as much as people think these things are subjective, they're not. A man can never be a woman. A man can't be a mother, and a man can't be a wife. And this great giant of a woman made it a priority in many, many of her meetings with women and girls of Lubavitch and outside of Lubavitch to teach them simply by the amount of importance she gave to looking after your husband and looking after your children. And the more you hear about her, the more you learn this lesson. And we would like to talk about how smart she was and how well educated she was and everything that she knew and the languages that she spoke and her contributions to science and industry and on and on and on and on. She wanted to talk about being a mother. She wanted to talk about being a wife. And she would even talk about mein man. She would talk about her husband, the Rebbe, and their relationship, because she appreciated acutely the need to instruct women and girls that being a mother and a wife is not a prison, it's not old-fashioned, it's not passé, it's not in the past. The Jewish people survived because of Yiddish amamis. There's nobody who's going to even question that. You know, the famous story with the Rebbe, a woman tells the Rebbe that she wants to have children like the Rebbe, so the Rebbe says without a hesitation, so then be a mother like my mother. And the Rebbetzin wanted so much, to teach that to women and girls that she interacted with. And of course, I guess the best way to end this little segment is with the story that the Rebbetzin said, repeated, it happened to her more than once, where people either foolishly or out of ignorance or insensitivity would say to the Rebbetzin, where are your children? You know, a woman who's as nurturing and as affectionate and as gentle as you should have been blessed with children. And she would respond, sometimes a bit surprised by the question, my children are in 770. She saw Lubavitch Hasidim, she saw Anash as her own, and there's a lot of evidence to support the concern that she had for individual members of the Lubavitch community. And Dr. Feldman, who knew her very well, says, he doesn't know how, but she knew everybody by name. She didn't only know the older Hasidim, from the last generation. She knew their children and grandchildren. He said she never walked the streets. She never interfaced with other people. And she knew. If a person in Crown Heights was ill, she knew about it, and she would call Dr. Feldman and ask, even people whom they had never discussed. He swears that she had Ruach HaKodesh, that she had extra powers, like the Rebbe would call it, and she knew things that a normal person could not know. And she saw Anash Chassidim as her children. Which leads me to the second thing that I want to focus on in terms of talking about the Rebbetzin in her life on this Chav Beis Shvat. And that's the institution of Shlichus. The Rebbetzin was the daughter of the previous Rebbe and the wife of the Rebbe. She watched first her father and then her husband send young couples, into very, very difficult situations. Very difficult situations. During her father's tenure, she even watched her father send people whom they loved into dangerous situations. And in some cases, the dangers materialized, and chas v'sholom le'aleinu, people lost their lives, and he did it anyway. Then she watched her husband, the Rebbe, send young American couples into very difficult material situations. The Rebbe would not, on principle, send people into dangerous situations, but he did send people into materially compromised places where food was not available, and education was not available, and basic amenities was not available. And she never questioned it. She knew that what the Tata tut, und was the man tut, darf sein. She knew that her father and her husband, not only because they were intellectually superior to her, although, people claim that she had a mind as great as theirs, but because of their responsibility and because of their holiness, knew that this is what needed to be done. That in times of crisis, in times that warrant Mesiras Nefesh, Rebbe Tzaddik with all the love that he has for his parishioners and his followers and his children, sends them into harm's way and sends them into very, very difficult situations. And she never, ever questioned the authority that they had to do this, which is remarkable if you think about it. She was such a sensitive woman. She was so full of love for people in general, even non-Jews, for people, for human beings, for animals, I'm sure. She was just full of ahava. And she understood that if her father does something or her husband does something, as courageous, as much courage and sacrifice it's going to require from the people he's sending off to these places, it must be. But it didn't mean that she couldn't worry about them. And one of the things which I'm learning over the years is the extent to which she concerned herself with the lives of the shluchim. She never interfered. In other words, it was never an idea that maybe this shliach shouldn't go to this place because it's going to be too difficult. She, in general, never questioned her husband, and certainly never questioned her father. Or I should say, she certainly didn't question her husband, and certainly didn't question her father. But she carried the worry in her heart about the sacrifices they made. She didn't stop for one moment thinking about the lives of the shluchim and the sacrifices they make and the difficulties they're undertaking. In her mind, it was absolutely clear that it must be. And it was absolutely clear that someone has to think about them, and she sat on President's Street and thought about them and worried about them. Mrs. Kahn, Rabbi Yossi wife, tells the famous story, where she visited the Rebbetzin. They were very close. Mrs. Kahn's mother was a Schneerson. They were cousins. And the Rebbetzin showed her a gift that she'd been given by the Shluchos. And Mrs. Kahn commented that the Shluchos love her. And they see her as a role model, as an inspiration, and so forth and so on. And the Rebbetzin said, why are they wasting their time and energy on me? I'm a simple woman. And Mrs. Kahn said to the Rebbetzin, that's not so. You're not a simple woman. You're certainly not a simple woman in the eyes of the Shluchos. And the Rebbetzin answered her in Russian, in a rather severe tone. She said to her, Leah, you don't understand how hard it is. You don't understand how hard it is. The shluchim, and especially the shluches, go off to these places, and then you see their successes and their buildings and their people and their notoriety and all the rest. In behind that reality is a family and children and a husband who are being raised and being looked after and nurtured and taken care of and fed and clothed and bathed and supported emotionally. And the Rebbetzin was acutely aware just how difficult this was to do without any support. And on the one hand, as a Hasidah, as a wife and a daughter of a Rebbe, she fully understood that if this is what needs to be, this is what it's going to be. But it didn't stop her from concerning herself with it, by thinking about it and doing what she could in her quiet way to support and to help them. I want to finish with a story. I'm going to stop now. There's some hands raised. I'll address the questions in a moment. I just want to tell you a story. This story is very interesting. And I can't tell it properly because I forgot all the details, but I actually went back to the source. I heard the story from the source, and I managed to... In Montreal, there's a professor named Professor Brower. When he got married, he's in the science field, in the biological field, in medicine, but he's a biologist. He asked the Rebbe, he was given 3 offers. I think one of them was Stanford University, and one of them was McGill in Montreal. Had 3 offers from 3 different universities to be hired as a researcher and as a professor. And he asked the Rebbe what to do. And he waited several days. And the Rebbe told him to go to McGill, which is in Montreal, where he went and where he still lives. And he always saw his professorship in McGill as a shlichus. The Rebbe sent him there. This is his place. So I heard the story from his daughter-in-law that I was in Montreal, and I asked him. He repeated the story to me, and I still don't remember all the details, and I apologize. The spirit of the story is that maybe 25 years after he became a professor, he found out through a third party that the head of the university had been called by Mrs. Schneerson in 1967 or 68. When he had asked the Rebbe which job to take, the Rebbe took several days to respond. The Rebbetzin made phone calls. And he found out later that she spent almost an hour on the phone talking to the head of the university, who later explained to Professor Brower that he didn't know who Mr. Schneerson was, but from the nature of her questions, he understood that she understood the university culture. She was asking questions about tenure and about vacation time and retirement. I mean, very practical questions that reflected a very deep understanding of what it means to be a professor. And she basically, she flushed out what would be the best for him in whatever ways. She came back to the Rebbe, or the Rebbe gave him his answer. And as Professor Brower said to me, he says, the Rebbe was a man of Ruach HaKodesh. He made decisions on a higher level, but he always wanted information. He always wanted information. In other words, even though the Rebbe was going to make this decision as a Rebbe, not as a professor, but first he wanted as much data as he could collect, and she collected that data for him. The story is interesting because it reflects many things. The first thing about it is, who ever knew that the Rebbetzin was busy doing these kinds of things behind the scenes for an individual person, one man? If she spoke 45 minutes to one professor, you can assume that she did that 3 times. Moreover, she literally acted as a mother, looking after a child. And of course, it was secret till after she passed away. This information was not disclosed. So in conclusion, I guess I should say, the Rebbetzin was a chassid of the Rebbe. And above all else, that meant that she trusted him. She trusted his judgment. She trusted his decisions. She never questioned her husband. She never disagreed with her husband. Not because that's how all women should treat their men, but because she was not married to an ordinary man and she wasn't an ordinary woman. And this is something we must all learn from her, to trust the Rebbe and to listen to the Rebbe and to remember that the prophecy, that we're living in the last generation of the Golus, the first generation of the Gula, is actual. I don't even want to say still actual. If she could trust his judgment, we certainly can. I want to thank you for your few minutes, and I want to sign off. I'm sure there is some kind of a moderator here. If you want me to field questions, I'll be happy to. Just tell me how to go about this. Okay?
Thank you, Rabbi Paltiel. I have no words. In fact, I shouldn't say any words after that. If there's anyone who has a question, we do have a Q&A option. If you can put it there, then we can Rabbi Paltiel can answer any questions.
I could try. I can't answer. I could try.
Okay, Rabbi Paltiel, there is a question.
Okay. Go ahead. I'm here.
The question that has been asked is, what are some things that the Rebbe and Rebbetzin did not share with us because we could not have handled it?
If they didn't share them with you, they didn't share them with me either. I once disclosed, somebody once told me that the Rebbetzin collected royalties from the United States Army for designing a revolver during the Second World War. She was an engineer just like that Rebbe. And I've been told that I'm not allowed to say that because it's none of our business. It's on my website in one of my classes. That's just a simple example. You know, it was known that the Rebbetzin went to school, what she studied and what she did. Would you have imagined that during the Second World War she served the United States Army and her whole life collected royalties? You got to be pretty smart to be an engineer, you know, but you have to be extraordinary for your being an engineer to be not a big deal. She didn't do that her whole life. She did that during the work. She spent the majority of her years in America as a librarian, and I think she probably did that just to keep herself busy more than anything else. That's one example, but the most important example is their relationship and in her place in her father's home. You know, people use the word royalty so liberally because we just assume that royalty is a nicer house and a fancier dress and better jewelry. Unfortunately, to a great extent, that's what royalty has become. But royalty really means a bigger person. And a bigger person, as I described in the beginning of my talk, they're just gifted in so many ways that you can't call them genius. They're just bigger. And in the case of a dynasty like the Schneersons, in the case of the Lubavitcher Rebbeim, it's the whole idea of seeing thousands and thousands and thousands of people as their children, and genuinely being big enough, having a big enough mind and a big enough heart to concern themselves individually with such a great number of people. The Rebbe, you can't say the Rebbe was a Rebbe over... The Rebbe was a Rebbe over 15, 16 million Jews. And the Rebbetzin was their mother. How is a person big enough for that much information, for that much detail, for so many tzaddiks, just to use that as a model? I just gave you two thoughts, but I assure you that there are so many things that we'll never know. The Rebbe said, when he was sitting Shiva, somebody said that, quote, I heard she was a great woman. And the Rebbe said, in my opinion, it's underestimated. People don't know who she was. You asked me to tell you what I don't know, so I made it up. So there. People ask me where I get my stories from, so my standard response is I make them up. But this story that I just told, I have a very, very good source for. A very good and reliable source. Okay, a gute Nacht, Yiddische Kinder, seid alle gesund und stark. We want Mashiach now. And then we'll all be together.
Amen, amen.
Kol Tuv Sela. A gute Nacht, Psuris Tevis. All the brachas of the Eibush, the Bona Chaim is eine Reviche. You should know, Chavbei Shvat is a Yom Segula. And we all know what the Baal Shem Tov said, that a Chassidish Fabrengen can accomplish more than Malach Mechol. When people get together and they cheer for each other, when one has a concern, everybody else shares that concern. And when one has a request, everybody asks for them. God Almighty is helpless, but to give them what they ask. So this is what one of the purposes of a Fabrengen is, that we can give each other brachas because we're all together, and the bracha of one is the bracha of all of ours. The needs of one is the needs of all of ours. Hashem should bless us all with health, full health. You know the meaning of health? The meaning of health is that you don't need a doctor. Not that the doctor can help you. We should have health, and we should have panasa, and we should have nachas, my children, Yiddische, Chassidische, Gesund, Yiddische, Chassidische nachas. And we should be full with Torah, Avodah, and Los Chasodim. Okay, a gute Nacht. Besudes Tevis.
Amen. Thank you, Rabbi Paltiel.